All right, this is our second main section, okay? Second main module in this sort of crash course of mechanical ventilation. Again, this is very quick. We'll refine it later. We're trying to get this out so people who are don't necessarily always take care of ventilated patients, but will be during this COVID-19 crisis, will have some basis to understand what's going on. Okay? So again, right now, you should have known and gone through and now understand at least what the normal scalars or normal waveforms on the ventilator should look like, all right? And now we're going to talk about pulmonary mechanics, and this is a very important section because what you're seeing on the ventilator can tell you a lot about what's going on in the lungs of your patient, all right? And again, eventually we want to get to the patient-ventilator interaction, and then we want to talk about what our priorities are. All right, but to do that, you got to know the scalars, and now you got to know the pulmonary mechanics. Okay, so we're going to go through that. All right, so I want you to, all right, pulmonary mechanics. All right, so I want you, if we take a simplified version of our sort of respiratory system, and we're going to say this is sort of the sum of all our alveoli, and these are our, airways. And let's say this is sort of our alveoli or lung, or lung parenchyma. All right. So again, the goal is to get flow. We got to get flow from the ventilator. Here's our ventilator into the patient. All right, and we do that somehow. How do we do that? And the question is, what pressure is required? All right, and that's called the driving pressure. All right, and this is a very important concept. All right, the driving pressure is the pressure required in order to get the flow into the lung, whether volume control or pressure control. Again, with volume, the vent has to set a pressure to push a certain flow in at a certain speed. So we're talking about driving pressure, which is very important, okay? And so whether it's a volume control or pressure control, the vent has to set a pressure in order to get flow in. So again, with volume control, you're doing that by setting the flow, and the vent is increasing its pressure to achieve that flow. In pressure control, you are setting a pressure, the vent is staying at that pressure, and the flow is occurring, all right? So that, the pressure to achieve whatever volume you want, let's just talk about that. It's essentially driving pressure, all right? So what pressure, what pressure or what forces does this flow have to fight against? Just think about it. We got to get it through the airways, and we got to open this up, So first, you have the resistive forces, which are pushing back, all right? So the pressure has got to be equal to the resistive forces. The resistive forces, all right? And what about here? What other forces? Well, the elastic forces, all right? What are the elastic forces? Well, they're the natural elastance of the lung. But if I sit on someone's chest, that is also a force that's got to be overcome. So it's partly the lung, it's also the chest wall. If you get a tremendous amount of edema and your chest wall is huge, then you're going to have increased forces that you got to push against. So the pressure is the sum of the resistance forces and the elastic forces, okay? So let's take it a little bit further. Again, we're trying to work through the equation of motion, which I don't like equations, but this one's important, all right? So that pressure, all right, is equal to the resistive forces. Now, what the resistive forces are equal to, and this comes, from electrical concepts, but, voltage equals essentially the current times resistance, all right? So just, this is sort of where it comes from. You have a tube, you have different voltages on either end, and you have a current and resistance. So just, trust me that this equals the flow times the resistance, all right? Those are what the resistive forces are, flow times resistance, all right? And what are the elastic forces? Well, the elastic forces equals, essentially the elastance times the volume. All right. Now, elastance is the opposite of compliance, all right? Is the inverse of compliance, all right? So elastance is the inverse of compliance, so this can also be written volume over compliance, all right? That makes sense. Now, if we want to take this further, the pressure that has to be exerted has to be equal to these. That pressure can either come from the muscles of the patient, all right, or can come from the vent, all right, equals flow times resistance plus volume over compliance. Now that pressure has also got to overcome the PEEP that you set, all right? This equation is the equation of motion, all right, in dealing with the respiratory system. And I know, you know, it seems complicated, but everything, you know, comes from here, all right? For the meantime, we're going to make this simpler, and we're saying we're dealing with paralyzed patients, all right? So we're going to just, you know, take that out. So essentially, we're just dealing with the pressure of the vents. You know, we can just essentially look at it like this, all right? Later, when we talk patient-ventilator interaction, remember that the pressure that's required, you know, can come both from the patient's muscles and the vent, all right? So here's our equation. And this is an all-important equation, and you can start to see how things change, how the pulmonary mechanics change, you know, with any kinds of changes in the vent, all right? So for example, let's say that you give a patient 10 liters of fluid in 2 minutes. Obviously you wouldn't do that, but let's say you do. What would happen, right? You have them on a volume control mode. You know, would the volume change? No. Would the flow change? No. You have let's say you have volume control and you're setting the flow. Would the resistance change? No, not necessarily. What would change? Your compliance would change, all right? Your lungs would fill up with fluid, you'd have a tremendous amount of pulmonary edema, and your compliance would decrease, all right? So what would happen? What would you have to do? What would the vent have to do to achieve that pressure? Well, if your compliance decreases, then this overall increases because your denominator decreases and your pressure would have to go up. And that's why you'll see, as people get worsening compliance, you're gonna have to require higher pressures to achieve that same volume, all right? Same thing, let's say you get a kink in the tubing, all right? What happens? Does your compliance change? No. Does your volume change? No. If you're on volume control, it's gonna try to push that volume in no matter what, all right? But what's gonna happen? Your resistance is gonna go up, flow is gonna stay the same. You're gonna have to, the vent's gonna have to use a lot more pressure to get that flow in. And that's why when you see a kink in the tubing, your resistance goes up and you see very high pressures, all right? And then they alarm, and that's why they're alarming, okay? Let's think of another situation. Let's say you have a patient on pressure control, all right? So you set this pressure, all right? Same thing, you know, what's gonna happen? Another kink in the tubing, what happens? Well, this is already set because you've set it on the ventilator. You know, your resistance is gonna shoot up, right? So this still has to equal this. What's gonna change? Is your compliance gonna change? No, the lung's the same, you just kink the tubing. But will your volumes go down? Yeah, your volumes will go down, you know, and your flow will probably decrease to equal this, all right? And so that's, you know, everything can really be explained by this equation, all right? And we'll make it more simpler in a second. You know, but let's say, for example, let's say we increase the PEEP by 2, all right? What would we expect, and we'll talk about, you know, pressure volume curve and where we are on it, but what would we expect if our compliance is staying the same, all right? Our volumes are staying the same, we didn't change that, and we still have the same tubing and the same resistance. What would we expect from the pressure on the vents? Well, you'd expect this to go up by 2, all right? So what happens? Let's say we increase our PEEP by 5. And let's say the pressure on the vent that you require is 10. Now, for the moment, when we check these pressures, we generally want to check the plateau pressure. So let's make this simpler. What is the plateau pressure? It's an end inspiratory hold. And what is the flow during an end inspiratory hold? It's 0, Okay, so let's just get rid of this because what we're moving towards is this idea of static compliance, which is the compliance of the lung when the flow is 0. And that's really how we measure a lot of pulmonary mechanics, all right? So again, we said the PEEP went up by 5, you set up by 5, and the plateau went up by 10. So what is going on? Let's say we're on volume control and this is staying the same, all right? So what must be happening? Your change in PEEP must have caused a change in the compliance, all right? And your compliance must have gone down, all right, in order to cause this to go up further, all right? Because that means this number had to go up, okay? And so essentially, I just want you, even doing away with PEEP, to understand that this primary equation, all right, and it seems simple, but that pressure equals volume over compliance, all right? This is a fundamental thing to just kind of remember. Soon you won't have to think of the equation, but this is the relationship, this is the physiologic relationship between pressure, volume, compliance in the lung. All right, again, if you set your volume up with the same compliance, your pressures are going to have to go up. If your compliance, you get a pneumothorax and your compliance, all of a sudden decreases, your pressures are going to have to go up. If you drop your pressure, if I have pressure control and I drop it from 20 to 10, the compliance isn't changing quickly in the lung, assuming nothing changed in 2 seconds, so what's going to happen? Your volumes are going to go down. All right, everything can be explained in essence by this equation, all right? And we're going to go back to it when we talk about driving pressure. All right? Again, I want you to think about why would a compliance change when you increase a PEEP, all right? And so this is the other very important aspect of pulmonary mechanics, and that is, what you call the pressure volume curve, all right? So this is pressure and this is volume. This is not drawn, perfectly, but all right. Everyone's lung, this is essentially a compliance curve. Again, compliance, if essentially pressure equals volume over compliance, then compliance equals volume over pressure, all right? So this is essentially a curve of one static compliance, all right? And what does this mean? This means that at a certain pressure, as you go increase in pressure, all right, you get an increase in volume. So if you increase pressure, let's say you increase pressure here, all right? Let's just say for intensive purposes, this is, 10 and this is 12 and you go here, then you get an increase in volume, from here to here, all right? So whatever this volume is, okay? And everyone's lung this is a natural property of everyone's lung at any given time, all right? And so, what I'll tell you is that right here is where you want people to breathe, all right? And this is generally where I'm breathing right now, where you're sitting at home breathing, is on this part of the compliance curve, which is to say that you generally have a linear relationship, and as you increase pressure, you get a certain volume. Increase pressure, get a certain volume. Increase pressure, get a certain volume. All right, so let's talk about what's happening up here. All right, here, for the same increase in pressure you got down here, you're just getting, for an increased pressure here, which is the same pressure you did here, you're getting just a little tiny volume. So what's happening? You're still giving the same amount of pressure. If we said it's two difference or whatever it is, why are you getting just a little bit of volume for the same increase in pressure? Well, this is over distension, all right? So now your alveoli over distended, and with the same amount of pressure you're giving, you're just getting a small increase in volume until you no longer, at some point, get an increase, all right? And what's going on down here? All right, same thing. With the same increase in pressure, you're just getting a little blip in volume, a little increase in volume. All right, this is under distension or atelectasis, all right? It's taking a lot of pressure to open the alveoli. And so really this is, when you're talking about how much PEEP to give or how much, pressure, APRV, we can, talk about that stuff later, but when you're generally talking about, where you want someone to sit and how much PEEP you should give, you really want them to be here. You don't want them to be understanded, where they could have atelect trauma, all right? Or you don't want to be overdistended, where they can get barotrauma, okay? Trying to figure this out is an important aspect. And so again, when we talk about, if your PEEP went up by, if again we look at the same equation, and we say the pressure equals volume over compliance plus PEEP. Okay, and again, this is flow equals 0. So for all intents and purposes, this is basically your plateau pressure. Okay, so if we say your PEEP went up by 5, all right, and this went up by 10, what happened? You're not in the linear part of the curve, all right? So now you've essentially, moved someone up here, all right? Okay, does that make sense? You basically increase the PEEP by 5, so you increase the pressure by 5, and yet the pressure you're seeing went up by 10. So something needs to be changing. So what's changing is your compliance, if you're not changing the volume, all right? So generally, one way that sometimes people try to judge if they're, over-distending or under-distending a lung, is if you move your PEEP up and you move your PEEP up, here's your plateau pressure and your PEEP, and if you move this up by, 2, and this goes up by 2, and now you're on 12, and then you move this up by 2, and it goes up by 2, now you're on 14, and then you move this up by 2, and this goes up by 4, and now you're on 18, then one can argue that, right here you have now over-distended the lung and you should back off. And really this goes to the concept of what a driving pressure is, all right? And this is, especially in COVID, as we start to try to determine, if patient is in, L or H, or they high compliance stage or low compliance stage, again, just think of this equation. And, a patient in a low compliance stage, essentially you're asking how much pressure are they going to need to achieve a certain volume. And obviously if your compliance is lower, then your pressure can be lower, to achieve a certain volume. Okay. All right. So again, if we're talking about, we want to talk about pressures, talk about driving pressure to develop this kind of concept. All right. All right. So, here's your equation again. All right. And we want to talk about your plateau pressure. All right. So let's say P plat. And remember, if it's P plat, remember this was in the equation too. All right. But we're talking about plateau pressure. So, this is 0, flow is 0. So we're just going to take it out. Okay. So essentially, if you kind of flip this around, and say, that in general, pressure equals volume over compliance, all right? And you want to know what the driving pressure is, then, essentially if you put this over here, essentially your driving pressure equals your plateau pressure. We'll just say P plat minus the P, okay? Again, this is going over here. In general, pressure equals volume over compliance. This is the pressure required to achieve whatever volume in a single state of compliance. All right, but in general, so this is what we call, driving pressure. Driving pressure. So you can easily, especially after your patients are intubated, you can do an inspiratory hold, get your plateau pressure, see what your PEEP is. And so if I ask you what's the driving pressure, you can, tell me or tell whoever, you can report that. Generally this is just a loose, under 14 is generally considered, that is better compliance. So we're going to try to figure out, how do we separate the H and the L types. Of course, these high compliance, low elastance L types, nearly everyone put on the ventilator, unless they were on CPAP, non-invasive, are gonna be an L type from what I've seen. So the driving pressure is perhaps something we should follow. Just a quick thing about driving pressure, there was everyone with these ARDSNet trials had generally looked at plateau pressures. What are our general guidelines for ARDSNet? Generally tidal volume 4 to 8 cc's per kilogram. Plateau pressure, P-plat, less than 30 and 32. These are kind of our pH. I forget exactly, but generally wanted over 7.2, 7.21 being at the low end of what we call permissive acidosis or permissive hypercarbia. Okay. Again, why do you want to do this? Essentially, the predominant idea, is that if we talk about lung injury, which is what we're trying to avoid, all right, there's generally thought to be 5 things which cause lung injury, which is, atellect trauma, barotrauma, oxygen toxicity, volutrauma, and what's called, biotrauma or dysynchrony. All right, one can argue what's the difference between volutrauma and barotrauma, because the volume is causing pressure. That's a whole debate. But in general, the goal is to avoid a lung injury, which is why, at least in the ARDSNet, you want your P-plat less than 30 and tidal volume 4 to 8. We'll talk about, possibly changing some of these with COVID patients. All right. In general, one thing that was studied out of Hopkins is they took a lot of the patients that I think were both enrolled and not enrolled in the ARDSNet trials, and they found patients where they looked at PEEP and mortality. And so just imagine, from the knowledge that we have, or the knowledge that you may have been taught, let's say this is a measure of your, PEEP and your plateau pressure, right? Let's say your PEEP is staying the same and your plateau pressure is going up. I think this was, Amatu and Brower at Hopkins put out a paper, which I can send too. And then let's think of a situation going down. Any PEEP's the same. Let's say they're both going up. All right. So, you could, let's say this is mortality, just think of what you would expect, all right? So if someone's on the same PEEP and their plateau pressure is going up, what would you expect of the mortality? Well, their plateau's pressure is going up, and sure enough, if these are just different, they're plotting PEEP along lines, you'd expect, as your plateau went up with the same PEEP, your mortality went up. All right, and that's kind of what they found. And let's say now at a certain PEEP, your plateau pressure is going down. All right, what would you expect with mortality? Well, you'd expect that these patients that exhibited these symptoms would be worse, and they would have more lung injury. But now let's think of this, and just try to think of what you would necessarily expect a patient to have. The PEEP's going up and the plateau pressure's going up. I think a lot of people would expect the mortality would go like that, and really they found that it was steady. And so really there's a big question now, this is the driving pressure, and the big question is the driving pressure really, what we should be looking at, which is the plateau minus PEEP. And is this the real marker of one's mortality? So that's just something to think about, and why driving pressure is becoming increasingly discussed notion, I think, in the last couple of years, and certainly when I was in fellowship. Now, one can argue that obviously, if your driving pressure is higher, all right, and remember volume compliance plus PEEP, all right. So if your driving pressure goes up, then it must suggest that your compliance is going down. So one could argue, well, it may not be the ventilator settings we set. It could just be that the sicker lungs obviously require, higher driving pressure to achieve a certain volume, at a set level of PEEP. So, in one sense, you could be saying that the sicker lungs had worse mortality, which may be something that, some people may say is obvious, but at least as far as these COVID lungs, I would check the driving pressure. I would report the driving pressure. There are other ways to understand pulmonary mechanics. All right. So, but generally, if the driving pressure, is less than 14 or 15, I think you're pretty safe to say that at least this is probably, a low, high compliance, low elastance, type L. All right. And if it's higher, if your driving pressure is 25, that's obviously much higher. Now, if you have a very, very large person with a huge chest wall, again, your elastic forces are going to be higher, your compliance is naturally going to be lower. So you certainly could have someone who generally has compliant lungs with a huge chest wall, and it may be higher than this, and they may still not be a true, were you to do a CAT scan, pathophysiologically, they may still be a type L patient, and that's where it gets difficult. Gatnoni talked about lung weight, and so really, when you're talking about what's going on in the lungs, the question is really what's in the lungs, not the whole chest wall and all the elastic forces. So, that's the stuff you just got to think about. But for, a general measure, 14 to 15 may be a decent cutoff. All right. Other things to look at if you're trying to figure out where to put the PEEP. And remember, we talked about volume control, right? So we said volume control should look like this. We said volume control, again, let's start with this curve. All right. And we said it should look like, this. So what you're seeing here is this. You're seeing the linear portion of the curve, and that's why I said if these are healthy lungs and you're ventilating right, this is what you want to see, So if instead you're seeing this, it's going up linearly and then it's going like this at the very end, which you may often see, what's going on here? And what you're saying is that for the same volume, because remember the flow, if we want to line these up, this is irregular, but again, the flow is steady. So you're saying that as now when you're pushing the flow in, you're requiring much more pressure. All right. And so this kind of suggests that you might be over distended. All right. And you might want to back up on the PEEP. All right. One thing I didn't mention is, I said that in volume control, the flow always has to be like this, and traditionally that is, this is what it looks like. This person has no PEEP, say these are equal. This is traditionally what volume control look like. These are all the same level. However, it is thought that this is a more uncomfortable way to breathe. If the patient is paralyzed, you can have them, on this, and this is called square waveform. Square waveform, obviously, because it looks like a square. All right, but there, modern vents have developed. It's thought that the pressure control way of breathing, the pressure control pattern, is more comfortable. So you have what's called descending ramp waveform. Which is, essentially the vent through, some algorithm essentially will drop the flow as it goes, and it will look like this. So don't be fooled by that. Now this is still, these are independent, all right? So it is setting this, all right? And it is doing it on purpose. All right, and if you can imagine what happens here, well, the flow is less here than here, so it'll more, it should more look like, start to approximate, a pressure controlled breath. But you can still look across the room because you should see that all of these look, the same. And it's not like pressure control going like this, it's just a descending ramp. So just something else to think about. Okay. I think that's all for pulmonary mechanics. All right. We're going to take a break, and then, later we'll go into ventilator lung interaction. Before I add this, I forgot the other thing you can see on volume control, right? So let's volume control. This patient again has no PEEP. All right. I told you that this initially was essentially your resistance. All right. I'm going to put inspiratory pause in this patient actually. All right. They're still going to have no PEEP. All right. Let's draw the independent. So when I say inspiratory pause, I'm going to put a pause at the end of inspiration. All right. Forgot to put it. All right. And so what is this going to look like? There's going to be a pause. All right. And this is the plateau pressure. Excuse my drawing, but these should look the same. All right. Remember I told you that this is the resistance. All right. And so essentially, this little blip, is flow times resistance. All right. This is volume over compliance. All right, right here. All right. And this is your sort of volume over compliance. All right. If your PEEP, let's say this was PEEP, this would be your PEEP. Okay. So essentially, when you're looking at a waveform on volume control, what would you expect if the tube was kinked? Let's say I just kink the tube right now, right? Does your compliance change? No. The compliance of the lung is the same, and you're still putting the same volume in. Your PEEP doesn't change, but your resistance changes, right? The flow is actually going to stay the same, and so what would you expect? Boom, if you kink a tube, this is what you'll see, all right? This will still look the same. Again, your volume over compliance is the same, all right? Let's say rather than kinking a tube, you just give someone a whole lot of pulmonary edema, and over a couple of hours, what would you expect to change? Again, this is flow times resistance, volume over compliance. This is PEEP, volume over compliance. So what changes? Your compliance goes down, and this goes up. But essentially, your plateau pressure is going to change. All right, but this will stay the same. All right. Let's say you get a pneumothorax and at the same time you get a bunch of gunk in your tubing. Well, this will go up, and this will change too. All right. So you can actually also look at your waveform, especially on volume control, to try to determine some of the pulmonary mechanics. And this is, if you see across the room, you should hear your peak inspiratory pressure will go up, but if this is shooting up, let's say you don't have a break here and this just comes down, but you see this is shooting up, and all of a sudden, you're looking across the room and you see, what looks like this, or really this would be higher. Let's say you see this, then you know that there's a tremendous amount of resistance, all right, and your peak pressures will alarm. All right.